Good morning. My name is Patrick, and thank you very much for clicking on my link to see my presentation, Beat Gestures and Prosodic Phrasing in French. I would also like to take a moment to thank the organizers for allowing us to present this work online. I'm very excited about this opportunity. And just so you know, this research is research that I'm carrying out as part of my PhD thesis under the supervision of Pilar Prieto and Elizabeth Delais-Roussarie. So let's get started. As most of us know, whenever we speak, we also tend to gesture. And these gestures can come in a lot of different shapes and can refer to speech in a lot of different ways. And so it's sort of like the classic categorization of gestures has basically been laid out by McNeil, where he talks about iconic gestures. So these are gestures that really show on your hands what we're talking about. So here's a nice example of an iconic gesture for you.
And finally, we could make the particles migrate to over the poles, so we could arrange the climate engineering so it really focused on the poles.
All right, so as you can see, he's talking about the poles of the Earth, and he actually shows us with his hands the poles of the Earth. So this is very imagistic and iconic. But we can also talk about metaphors. So a metaphoric gesture will essentially take symbols and sort of show them on the hands this way. So here's an example of a metaphoric gesture.
It's saying that you do some geoengineering for a little while.
So he sort of moves his hand forward and he says for a little while. And so obviously this sort of movement forward is sort of to represent the passage of time, right? We can also point to things. So here's an example of a dialectic gesture,
which would have minimal bad impacts in the middle of the planet where we live.
So again, he's talking about the middle of the planet, and he's literally showing us where the middle of the planet is. And finally, we have beat gestures. So here's an example of a beat gesture.
Really, we're doing this, basically.
So he says, really, we're doing this, and he does this sort of downward movement, but as we can see, this gesture doesn't really have any sort of semantic meaning that really relates to what he's saying in speech. So this has been sort of categorized as this sort of beat gesture. The definition is generally the small flick of the hand or something that oftentimes is said to go with prosodic prominence, or is to be beating out the rhythm of speech. But interestingly enough, we can't forget that the other gestures do sort of have relationships with prosody as well, and this has been explored. So while we're talking about gesture and prosody, let's see how these two kind of come together. So as I just said, numerous studies have looked at the temporal alignment of gestures with speech. But what's something to be aware of is that a lot of these studies have looked at different parameters in terms of landmarks in both speech and gesture. So for an example, some studies have looked at overlap between the stroke and the pitch accented syllable, where the stroke is sort of the most meaningful part of the gesture. Other studies have looked at overlap between gesture hits and pitch accented word, which the gesture hit is sort of seen as these bouncy movements or like periods where the velocity of the gesture changes or suddenly stops or anything like this. And this definition is very similar to the apex, which studies have also looked at overlap between the apex and the pitch accent. So gesture hit and apex are more or less the same thing. And then some studies have also looked at correlations between the apex and the pitch peak. Okay, and most of these studies have found fairly high rates of alignment, although some have found mixed results. So another thing to take into account is that not only do these studies look at different parts of gestures and different parts of speech, but also when we consider the gesture type that I was just talking about earlier, we see that these studies down here tend to sort of focus on all gestures as a whole. They don't really separate out the different types. They just look at them as a whole. Whereas these studies over here focused on head nods and dialectic gestures, and these over here focused on beat gestures. Okay, so numerous studies talking about the temporal alignment with gestures and speech, looking at different things. However, the general conclusion is that there is a strong tendency for strokes and apexes to co-occur with pitch accented syllables. However, a lot of these studies use very, very short corpora, and most of the corpora were in English or other languages where pitch accentuation had a prominence lending function. So less is known about languages where pitch accents serve a demarcative function such as French. And when I say demarcative function, I mean that they're marking prosodic edges. That is their main function. Okay. So let's talk about French prosody for a minute. In French, we could have a sentence like I called the President of the Republic, which sounds like this.
J'ai téléphoné au président de la République.
And it looks like this. So basically in French, what we'll do is we'll take the sentence and we'll break it up into little chunks. These little chunks, I'm going to call them APs, okay? And these APs always have a pitch accent on the last full syllable of the AP. This pitch accent in this position is obligatory. Every AP has to have a pitch accent on the final full syllable. So I'll play it one more time so you can actually hear the pitch accents.
J'ai téléphoné au président de la République.
All right. And then, so these pitch accents are the obligatory, what we call the final accent, but you can also have what we call an initial accent. So this initial accent is not obligatory, it is optional. It is oftentimes produced for various reasons, things like keeping rhythm or to add emphasis or something like this. So we can take literally the same sentence and add an initial accent. So this is what it would sound like.
J'ai téléphoné au président de la République.
I'll show you one more time.
J'ai téléphoné au président de la République.
So we see that there we have an initial accent on the first syllable of president. Okay. So the initial accent, optional, the final accent is obligatory. Just keep this in mind, okay? So what we wanted to know was, in French, do beat gestures temporally associate with pitch accent syllables, and is there a preference for initial accents or final accents? Secondly, if you go back to the information I was presenting earlier, there was one study in particular that looked at beat gestures, and that was by Chateau-Koefnagel and Wren in 2018, and they found that 83.13% of beat gesture strokes overlapped with a pitch accented syllable. So I think this is very interesting because that means almost 17% don't align prosodically. So we were interested to know what's happening when beat gesture apexes do not associate with pitch accented syllables. So we have our two research questions, and in order to get to the answer, we decided to look at some TED Talks. We took two French TED Talks and we annotated them, and because in the data analysis we wanted to have sort of a similar amount of annotation, something that's comparable, we ended up with 13 minutes and 23 seconds of annotations where each speaker is gesturing more or less for 4 minutes. Okay, so we have 4 minutes of gesturing that we're going to look at. What we did was we annotated for gesture and elan. So we annotated gesture phrasing, so preparation, stroke, recovery, any holds, anything like this. We also annotated the apex. So the apex for us, we defined it the way that Rohrer and Yasinic find it. That is any sudden stops, changes in direction, or anything like this, the end point of the gesture, basically. And we did the gesture phasing and the apex, we did it without sound. So that way we wouldn't be influenced by the audio from the speaker. And after we annotated those two, we went back with the sound to determine the gesture type to see if there was any iconicity, metaphoricity, or if it was a non-referential beat gesture. Okay. Independent of these analyses, we also did some French Toby analysis in Prot, and we took our French Toby analysis, we imported it into Elan, and then from there we exported a really large database. And then what I did with this large database is I fed it into a personal Python script, where this Python script, what it does is it looks at every syllable, and then it determines what phenomena are occurring on a syllable by syllable basis. So we see if the syllable has a gesture apex on it or not. If it does have a gesture apex on it, we do take account what type of gesture, right? If it has a pitch accent, we also take into account if it's an initial accent or a final accent. And finally, we also took into account the position of the syllable within that phrase. So if it was the first syllable, the second syllable, the third syllable, etc. All right, so let's see what we got. The first results, I think it's very important to talk about the gesture production by type. where we basically found that beat gestures are by far the most produced gesture type. Now, this is also adding to evidence from Chateaucouf, Nagel, and Wren, who said that these sorts of academic style speeches tend to produce beat gestures, essentially. So here we actually see the amounts per gesture type, and we see that beat gestures make up about 90% for both of our speakers. So we have lots of beat gestures to look at. And now from this point forward, all of the analysis that I'll be discussing, we're really focusing on what's happening with these beat gestures and not so much the iconics, metaphorics, or dialectics. All right, so now we wanted to know about preference for initial accent or final accent. And what we see is actually our speakers behave very differently. Our first speaker has a tendency to mark the final accent at a higher rate than the initial accent, whereas our second speaker, JP, he has a higher tendency to mark the initial accent than the final accent. So these are our first results, which seem kind of unclear because of the individual variation. So we have two speakers that act differently, let's say. But I think what's more before we move on to that, I wanted to show some examples. So here's an example of a B gesture where the apex is falling on the initial accent. So you'll see that this gesture falls on the first syllable of tristesse, frustration, and déception. So here's an example.
Une forme de tristesse, frustration, déception. Une forme de tristesse, frustration, déception. Une forme de tristesse, frustration, déception.
And then we have another example where it's falling on the final accent, where basically it says dans la conduite de leur négociation, where conduite is getting the obligatory final accent along with the beat apex.
Dans la conduite de leur négociation. Dans la conduite de leur négociation. Dans la conduite de leur négociation.
All right. So, but I think what's more interesting than these ones that align are what's happening with the ones that do not align. So here we see by the raw number of apexes, how many align with initial, how many align with final, and how many align with no accent. And what we find is really quite surprising. So the alignment rates of the beat gesture apexes with pitch accentuation are much lower than what's been previously reported in the literature. One speaker had less than 60%, the other only had 41% of alignment. That means that more than half of this person's beat gestures do not align with a pitch accent. So like I said, if we sort of situate this in the literature, we say that it is much lower than what's been previously found when other people have looked at the apex with pitch accentuation. So it's very, very surprising. We also, wanted to back up a little bit and say, okay, well, what if we take the stroke, which is a little bit of a larger duration, so maybe there will have some more alignment. And while we do have some more alignment, it still is pretty low compared to what's been previously reported in the literature. So we had around 70% alignment of strokes with pitch accentuation, whereas the most comparable study to this is the Chateaucouf, Nagel, and Wren study that found 83% of alignment between strokes and pitch accents. So I think that that's pretty exciting, and so I want to show you some examples of this. However, before I show you these examples, I do want to bring up a couple of points. First of all, previous research has shown that apex is produced up to 400 milliseconds before a stress syllable may be perceived as aligned. So sometimes when you're looking at these examples, you might say it and say, oh, that seems really aligned. And then you play it 5 or 6 times, and then you start to say, okay, maybe it's not quite as aligned as I originally thought. So, and also you have to consider the way that we define the apex. So for us, the apex are moments of zero velocity, sudden stops, and sudden changes in direction, okay? So sometimes it might seem like it aligns, but it's not actually aligning with what we define as the apex. So that being said, what I would recommend, I'm going to play each video 3 times at least. So what I would recommend is you close your eyes and listen the first time, maybe even the first 2 times, and then just listen, try to detect the prominence, and then open your eyes and see if the apex is occurring on that syllable where you detected prominence. So here's our first example where the speaker says "à quel prix," and we have "prix," which has a very clear pitch accent, but the apex is actually falling just before it on "quel."
Et à quel prix? Et à quel prix? et à quel prix?
Okay. And then here's another example where it's two of them that happen one after the other, and neither of them align. For me, I think that it's clear the second one, comment respire. But with this one, I'm going to show you 3 times at regular speed and then 2 times in slow motion.
Que l'on négocie comme on respire. Que l'on négocie comme on respire. Que l'on négocie comme on respire.
All right, so what's happening here? In order to kind of figure out, we decided that we wanted to look at where these beat gestures are falling in these APs. So what we did was we took all of the APs that had only a final accent, so no initial accent, and also had a non-accented beat. So that means that in every AP, this final syllable was accented, and then somewhere else in that phrase, there was a beat gesture, okay? And what we do is when we look at where these gestures fall, we see that they tend to go towards the left, right? So many on the first, second, maybe third syllable, and then it drops off. And so if we compare this to actually what the initial accent did of these speakers, we see that it follows the exact same pattern. So we have the greatest number on the second syllable position, and then a sharp decrease afterwards. So I think that this is a very, very exciting and something definitely unexpected. So what do we say about this now? Well, we think that beat gestures might not be as tightly coupled with pitch accents in French compared to other languages. So for example, in English. When they are coupled, our data does not really show that there's a clear tendency for one pitch accent type over another, whether it's initial or final, etc. However, when they're not coupled, it seems like that these beat gestures are still marking sort of prominence accepting positions in speech independent of pitch accentuation. And this kind of calls back to the results by Fung and Mok, who looked at diacritic gestures in Cantonese and found that basically the diacritic gestures were not influenced by pitch or tone because Cantonese is a tonal language where tone has sort of a lexical function. And so as such, the tone is sort of occupied and does not act as an attractor for the diacritic pointing, right? They actually found that that the diaxis tended to align with focused words, where focused words did have a durational contrast. However, in disyllables, even if they put a longer duration on the second syllable, the apex always fell on the first syllable, which I think is an interesting parallel here because they claim that this sort of first syllable position tends to be a more prominent position in general. So I think that this has some very interesting parallels with what we found here. However, there's also some things to consider. First off, there are differences in gesture production. First, as we saw, individual differences. So our two speakers, they had differences in whether they marked the initial accent or the final accent. So this is one thing to consider and why we need larger databases. But also differences in genre. So here we're talking about TED Talks, and TED Talks are obviously rehearsed, and people are even trained to gesture for their TED Talk. So of course, this is a very specific style of speech. It would be interesting to see other types of speech as well, maybe narrations and spontaneous speech, where things might be a little different. Also, we didn't control for pragmatic intent. I did mention earlier that initial accent can sometimes be rhythmic in nature. Other times it can really be pragmatic and have, an emphatic sort of meaning behind it. We didn't control for these differences. So it is possible that our two speakers, one may have had more emphatic initial accents, whereas the other had less, and that might influence why one had gestures more on initial accent than final accent. Unfortunately, we did not control for that, so something to consider. Something else is how we operationalize the apex. So we looked at the apex as it is, points in sudden stops, changes in velocity, changes in direction. I think it would be really interesting to add to that things like points of maximum velocity, for example, which we did not do. And finally, I think the take-home message is that we really need a more flexible view on the association of pitch accents and beat gestures for both prominence and, in the case of French, phrase marking, and that this term beat gesture maybe is not the most adequate term because it's so embroiled with this meaning behind beat and rhythm and prosody, and we see that these gestures actually, at least in French, do not seem to be exactly aligning perfectly with prosody in such a way that the word makes it seem. So I think that pretty much sums up my talk. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Muchas gracias. And I'm looking forward to receiving your questions and feedback. Thank you.